June 21st, 1813. A valley in northern Spain. King Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother, placed on the Spanish throne by force, had a problem, a very expensive problem. Behind him, a convoy of 3,000 wagons stretched for miles. They carried Spain's looted treasures, gold, silver, paintings stolen from palaces, the crown jewels, personal fortunes of French officers who'd grown rich occupying 5 years of occupation. £2 million sterling, the wealth of a nation. Joseph had two choices: abandon the treasure and move fast, or keep the wagons and move slowly. He chose the treasure. That decision would cost him everything, because somewhere in those hills, Wellington was watching. And Wellington had noticed something interesting about slow-moving convoys protected by distracted armies. They made excellent targets. This is Vitoria, and what you're about to discover will show you what happens when greed meets tactical genius. Welcome to Britain's history. Today, we're diving into the battle where Wellington proved he wasn't just a defensive genius. He was a master of offensive warfare who could destroy armies when given the chance. Because Vitoria wasn't a desperate last stand or a narrow victory. It was systematic annihilation, British tactical superiority on full display, and the moment when 6 years of Peninsular War finally paid off. But before we get to that valley, before we watch Wellington's 4 columns converge on the surprised French, we need to understand how Britain and France ended up fighting over Spain. Because without knowing why Joseph Bonaparte was even on the Spanish throne, you can't appreciate the sweet justice of watching him flee with his stolen treasures. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more battles lined up, each one showing British military excellence. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1807, when Napoleon made one of his biggest mistakes. He decided to conquer Spain. Not because Spain threatened France. Spain was a French ally. But because Napoleon wanted total control of Europe, and he didn't trust Spanish loyalty. So he invaded, forced the Spanish royal family to abdicate, and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people exploded in fury. They didn't want a French king. They especially didn't want Napoleon's brother, a man with no connection to Spain, no understanding of Spanish culture, and no legitimacy beyond French bayonets. The Peninsular War began, a brutal conflict of guerrilla warfare, conventional battles, and atrocities on all sides. Britain saw an opportunity. If Spain would resist French occupation, Britain would support them. An army under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal in 1808. For the next 5 years, Wellington fought a careful campaign, never risking his army unnecessarily, choosing defensive positions brilliantly, slowly pushing French forces back. By 1813, Napoleon was desperate. His Russian campaign had been a catastrophe. In 1812, he'd invaded Russia with 600,000 men and returned with perhaps 100,000 survivors. Now Austria, Prussia, and Russia were forming a new coalition against him. Napoleon needed every soldier he could get. He couldn't afford to keep 200,000 troops occupying Spain when Germany was about to explode in war. Napoleon ordered his armies to evacuate Spain and concentrate in southern France. King Joseph would command the evacuation, gathering French forces and withdrawing in good order. But Joseph had a problem. He'd been living like a king for 5 years, looting Spain systematically. He'd accumulated an enormous fortune, and he wanted to take it with him. Think about Joseph's position for a moment. You're Napoleon's brother, but everyone knows you're just a puppet. You've been king of Spain, but the Spanish hate you. Now you're being ordered to abandon the country you've been looting for years. Do you leave the treasure behind? Or do you pack it all into wagons and try to escape with it, knowing it will slow you down? Joseph chose the treasure. That choice would cost him his army. Wellington watched French forces concentrating around Vitoria in early June 1813. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The French were vulnerable, loaded with plunder, focused on evacuation rather than fighting, and concentrated in a valley that could be surrounded. Wellington had 75,000 troops, British regulars, Portuguese allies, and Spanish guerrillas. The French had about 65,000 combat troops, but thousands more civilians, camp followers, and officials cluttering the roads. Wellington's plan was audacious. He would attack from 4 directions simultaneously, converging on Vitoria from the west, north, and south, while blocking the eastern escape route into France. If it worked, he trapped the entire French army and baggage train. If it failed, if the French detected his approach and deployed properly, Wellington's divided forces could be defeated piecemeal. On June 20th, Wellington's columns began their approach. They moved through mountains and rough terrain, staying hidden from French scouts. The British advance was a masterpiece of coordination. 4 separate columns, moving independently, had to arrive at Vitoria simultaneously from different directions. Any mistake in timing would ruin the plan. The French had no idea Wellington was coming. Joseph's headquarters was celebrating the night of June 20th. Officers drank wine. Courtiers gossiped. The 3,000 wagons of plunder were ready to move. Tomorrow, they'd begin the march to France. The war in Spain was over. They'd lost, but at least they'd leave rich. June 21st dawned clear and warm. Around 8 a.m., French sentries on the western hills spotted something that made their blood run cold. British columns emerging from the mountains. Not a reconnaissance force, not a small detachment. Entire divisions, tens of thousands of troops, and they were already in attack formation. Panic spread through the French camp. Joseph's staff rushed to deploy the army for battle, but it was already too late for a proper deployment. Wellington's columns were attacking from multiple directions. French troops had to form battle lines while under fire, without proper reconnaissance, without knowing where all the enemy forces were. The French defensive position around Vitoria was actually quite strong, if they'd had time to occupy it properly. Hills dominated the valley. Villages could be fortified. Streams created obstacles. But Wellington had given them no time. The British attacked before the French could fully deploy. On the western approach, General Hill's column, 25,000 British and Portuguese, attacked the village of Subijana de Alava. French troops under General Gazan fought desperately to hold the village. This was exactly the kind of fighting where British infantry excelled. Disciplined volleys, coordinated attacks, superior training telling against French forces who were surprised and disorganized. Hill's men took Subijana after fierce fighting, then pushed forward toward the main French positions. French artillery pounded them, but British guns answered. The roar of cannon echoed through the valley. Smoke began obscuring the battlefield, and this was just the opening act. To the north, Wellington personally commanded the center column. He'd positioned himself where he could coordinate the entire battle, watching all 4 attacks develop simultaneously. Around 10 a.m., he ordered his center to advance. British regiments, in their distinctive red coats, moved forward in perfect formation. These were veterans, men who'd fought at Talavera, Salamanca, and a dozen other peninsular battles. They knew their business. The French center, commanded by Marshal Jourdan, one of Napoleon's most experienced officers, tried to form a coherent defense. But it was impossible. They were being attacked from the west by Hill, from the north by Wellington's center, and now reports came of Spanish forces appearing in the south. The nightmare was becoming reality. They were surrounded. Around noon, the fighting reached its crescendo. British and French infantry lines stood at close range, trading devastating volleys. At 100 yards, muskets were deadly. Men fell in heaps. The wounded crawled toward cover. Officers on horseback directed fire, making themselves obvious targets. The din was incredible. Thousands of muskets firing, artillery thundering, men shouting orders that were immediately lost in the noise. But British discipline was telling. Wellington's infantry could fire a volley every 20 seconds, faster than the French, more coordinated, more deadly. When French officers tried to rally their men for counterattacks, British volley fire tore apart the formations before they could charge. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't heroic cavalry charges or desperate last stands. It was systematic, professional destruction of enemy forces through superior training and discipline. On the French left flank, disaster struck. British cavalry under General Long found a gap in the French line, a space between units that hadn't properly linked up in the rushed deployment. Long's cavalry charged through the gap, getting behind French infantry positions. Suddenly, French soldiers found themselves under attack from behind. Units began to break. Officers lost control. What had been a battle line became a mass of confused, frightened men trying to figure out where the enemy was. King Joseph, watching from his headquarters, realized the battle was lost. Around 2 p.m., he gave the order to retreat. But retreat where? Wellington's 4th column, under General Graham, had blocked the main road to France. The only escape route was a single narrow road through the mountains to Pamplona. And that road was already clogged with the 3,000 wagons of plunder that Joseph had insisted on bringing. The French retreat became a rout. Soldiers abandoned their positions and ran toward the escape route. But the wagons blocked the road. Traffic jammed completely. Soldiers pushed wagons aside, dumped treasures into ditches, stole horses to escape faster. French discipline, so vaunted in Napoleon's Grand Army, dissolved completely. Wellington ordered his cavalry to pursue. British and Portuguese horsemen thundered after the fleeing French, cutting down stragglers, capturing guns, seizing wagons full of loot. Spanish guerrillas, who'd been fighting French occupation for 5 years, emerged from the hills and joined the pursuit. They showed no mercy. This was payback for 5 years of brutal occupation. The battlefield became a treasure hunter's paradise. British soldiers found wagons filled with gold coins, silver plate, paintings from Spanish churches, jewelry from noble families, even the Spanish crown jewels. Some soldiers became instantly rich, stuffing their packs with gold. Officers tried to restore order, but it was hopeless. After years of hard campaigning with poor pay, British soldiers weren't going to ignore French plunder literally scattered across the battlefield. One British officer found Joseph's personal carriage, a magnificent coach fitted with every luxury. Inside was Joseph's chamber pot, made of solid silver. The officer kept it as a souvenir. It's now in a British museum, still labelled the Emperor's Chamber Pot, a perfect symbol of how thoroughly Joseph's pretensions had been humiliated. Marshal Jourdan abandoned his marshal's baton, the symbol of his rank, given personally by Napoleon. A British soldier found it and presented it to Wellington. Wellington sent it to the Prince Regent in London as a trophy. The Prince was so delighted, he promoted Wellington to Field Marshal. A French marshal's baton had cost France an army and gained Britain a Field Marshal. The casualties at Vitoria tell the story of complete British victory. British and Allied losses, approximately 5,000 killed and wounded. French losses, about 8,000 killed and wounded. But more devastatingly, 2,000 captured and almost the entire French baggage train destroyed or captured. More than 150 French artillery pieces were lost. £2 million sterling worth of treasure, Spain's looted wealth, was recovered. But the strategic consequences were even more important than the tactical victory. King Joseph fled into France, never to return to Spain. The Spanish throne was vacant. Napoleon's brother was a laughingstock, the man who'd lost an entire kingdom in one afternoon. French power in Spain was broken forever. Within months, Wellington would be across the Pyrenees, invading southern France itself. The news of Vitoria electrified Europe. Napoleon was already under pressure from the Sixth Coalition in Germany. Now, he'd lost Spain too. Austria, which had been considering remaining neutral, joined the coalition against France. Vitoria convinced Europe's powers that Napoleon could be beaten, that Wellington had developed tactics and training that could consistently defeat French armies. In Britain, the celebration was enormous. Church bells rang. Newspapers proclaimed Wellington a hero. The government, which had sometimes questioned the cost of the Peninsular War, was vindicated. 6 years of fighting in Spain had paid off. France was being pushed back on all fronts. Wellington, now Field Marshal Wellington, was Britain's greatest general since Marlborough, a century before. And then came the most unusual tribute of all. Ludwig van Beethoven, the greatest composer of the age, was commissioned to write a piece celebrating Wellington's victory. Beethoven composed Wellington's Victory, or Battle Symphony, a dramatic orchestral work depicting the Battle of Vitoria with musical representations of cannon fire, British and French marching songs, and finally triumphant British victory fanfares. Think about that. The greatest musical genius of the age, writing a symphony about a British military victory. Beethoven was German, not British. But Vitoria mattered so much, symbolized such a turning point in European history, that even a German composer felt compelled to celebrate it. The piece premiered in Vienna in December 1813 to enormous acclaim. It's not considered Beethoven's finest work. It's literally program music describing a battle, but its very existence shows how Vitoria resonated across Europe. From a British perspective, Vitoria validated everything Wellington had been trying to achieve in the peninsula. For 6 years, critics had questioned his cautious strategy, his refusal to risk his army unnecessarily, his methodical approach. But Wellington had been building something, an army that could not only defend but attack, that could not only survive but destroy French forces decisively. British infantry at Vitoria proved they were the finest in Europe. Their disciplined volleys, their ability to hold formation under fire, their coordination with Portuguese allies, all of it came together perfectly. And Wellington's generalship was sublime. Coordinating 4 columns across mountains to converge simultaneously on an enemy position is extraordinarily difficult. One column arriving early gets isolated and defeated. One arriving late leaves gaps. Wellington's staff work, his timing, his understanding of terrain, all were perfect. From a French perspective, Vitoria was humiliation. Not just military defeat, but the complete collapse of Joseph's government, the loss of all their accumulated plunder, and the exposure of how vulnerable French armies had become. Marshal Jourdan, explaining the defeat to Napoleon, had to admit that British infantry and tactics were now superior to French. That admission, from one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, was devastating. Napoleon, when he learned of Vitoria, reportedly flew into a rage. He'd ordered his brother to evacuate Spain carefully, preserving the army for future operations. Instead, Joseph had lost the army, the artillery, the baggage, the plunder, and Spain itself in one catastrophic afternoon. Napoleon never forgave Joseph. Their relationship, already strained, was permanently damaged. But the most important consequence was strategic. With Spain lost, Napoleon had to defend France itself from the south. He was now fighting on 2 fronts: Wellington advancing through the Pyrenees from Spain, and the Sixth Coalition pushing from Germany. French resources were stretched to breaking. Every battle fought against Wellington was troops that couldn't fight in Germany. Every gun lost at Vitoria was a gun that couldn't defend France. Wellington crossed into France in October 1813, taking the war onto French soil for the first time. Over the next 6 months, he fought a series of battles through southwestern France. The French fought harder, defending their homeland, but Wellington's army, now a finely honed instrument of war, kept winning. By April 1814, Napoleon abdicated. The Peninsular War was over. Wellington had gone from defending Portugal in 1808 to occupying southern France in 1814. The modern town of Vitoria is a prosperous Basque city in northern Spain. There's a monument to the battle, erected in the 19th century. Tourists can visit the battlefield, though urban development has covered much of the ground where the fighting occurred. Each year on June 21st, historical societies commemorate the battle with ceremonies and reenactments. It's remembered in Spain as the day French occupation ended, in Britain as one of Wellington's greatest victories, and in France as a disaster best forgotten. The treasures looted by the French and recovered at Vitoria had varied fates. Some were returned to their rightful Spanish owners. Some disappeared into British regimental museums as trophies. The Spanish crown jewels were eventually returned to the Spanish royal family. Joseph's silver chamber pot remains in a British museum, still mocking the pretensions of Napoleon's brother. Wellington himself considered Vitoria one of his finest achievements. He'd faced larger armies at Waterloo, fought more dramatic battles at Salamanca, conducted more brilliant defensive operations at Torres Vedras. But Vitoria was complete, a perfect convergence attack that trapped and destroyed an entire French army. It validated his years of careful campaigning in the peninsula and proved British arms could not only compete with, but dominate French forces. The battle also demonstrated something important about warfare. Logistics matter as much as tactics. Joseph's insistence on evacuating with 3,000 wagons of plunder made his army slow, vulnerable, and unable to maneuver properly. When Wellington attacked, those wagons became a liability that blocked retreat and created chaos. If Joseph had abandoned the treasure and moved fast, he might have escaped with his army intact. His greed cost him everything. Today, military historians study Vitoria as a masterclass in coordinated attack. Wellington's ability to move 4 columns independently through difficult terrain, coordinate their arrival time, and execute a convergence attack that trapped the enemy is still taught at staff colleges. Modern armies with radios and GPS struggle to coordinate multi-axis attacks. Wellington did it in 1813 with messengers on horseback. That's operational genius. The Battle of Vitoria was also the last major battle of the Peninsular War. Everything after was pursuit and cleanup operations. One battle, one afternoon in June 1813, ended 6 years of war and French occupation. Spain was free. Britain had won. And Wellington had proven himself the greatest British general since Marlborough 110 years before. If this is the kind of history that makes you proud, British tactical superiority, Wellington's genius, complete victory over French occupation, then you know what to do. This channel exists to tell these stories of British military excellence. What other battles should we cover? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that made Britain great, told the way they deserved.